Good afternoon. It's my honor to be present here at the Law Faculty of Himachal Pradesh University and to speak about a subject which holds a lot of significance to Tibetans as well as people of Shimla, because we are going to talk about a document that was signed here in Shimla 100 years ago. When we are observing this centenary document, we are doing it from two perspectives. One is to recall and reflect on a document which was signed as an important document between three parties: Tibet, British India and China. And also secondly, in the light of the situation of Tibet today, I think I should inform you that Tibet today is under China, and the situation is much worse than what was 100 years ago. So this situation we must keep in mind when we are speaking about it. And therefore, for Tibetans, to speak about Shimla Agreement is with a lot of history and a lot of reflection on what is the situation today. In one aspect, we think that our participation in Shimla Agreement on equal footing with China, British India, was significant as a nation. But at the same time, today we are not a nation, we are under occupation of China. So that is a historical situation that we have to keep in mind. Now, my topic today is this international status of Tibet at the time of Shimla Agreement 1914. So I'll be limited to that scope. When we try to understand the international status of Tibet during the Shimla Agreement, we have to understand what was the international geopolitical situation around the world, in Asia, in British India, and in China before 1914. And in the light of where Tibet stood between these two giants then as well as today. If we look into the history, we find that in the early 20th century, British India was at the highest point of its imperial history. And also we have China on the other side, which was a very big power. And between these two countries, we have had Russia. So Rudyard Kipling had mentioned about the games these three nations played on Asia called the Great Game. The Great Game was how to obtain maximum territorial occupation under each imperial nation, that is Britain, Russia and China, in order to expand each nation's superiority around the world and especially in Asia. How did these countries try to influence the status, life of other smaller nations? And in this light, therefore, Tibet also became a tool of three great imperial nations. For example, in the case of Great Britain, as you will recall in your Indian history, it had reached the northernmost point of Afghanistan and Kashmir, even to the northeast. So the frontier of British India was secured until the Himalayas. But it had fears of influence on Asia, from north from Russia and from east from China, coming at crossroads of the Tibetan plateau. So to secure its subcontinental influence, it had to secure the borders beyond the Himalayas, at least to cushion any threat from the Himalayas, trying to obtain a small or big or a very big buffer territory, which we learn in history. So in the case of Great Britain, therefore, we see that at the best it was trying to expand its territory to the utmost northern part of Tibet, and at least to secure a firm Himalayan border. In that context, therefore, it tried numerous ways to deal with Tibet. Now, one popular event in Tibetan history, also in British India's history, is Young Husband's expedition of 1904. This expedition took place because whatever Great Britain could obtain any kind of advantages on Tibetan life through negotiation with China, Tibetans did not honor any of those agreements. They were stubborn, they resisted, even at times when British Indian imperial forces came across the Himalayas. Tibetan leaders and poor military people sat on the ground to stop them coming further. So, unable to obtain any meaningful benefits through negotiation with China, Great Britain forced its way into Tibet in 1904 under the Young Husbands expedition, and they came until Lhasa, and they forced an agreement with Tibetans called Lhasa Convention. Now that was the time when under Lord Curzon we learned the policy of British India called the forward policy, moving as much as forward as possible to secure further British territorial occupation. But from 1904, then there has been a change in British policy where they came about what we call non-interventionist policy, similar to the Panchshil Agreement, where British did not want to intervene, wanted to stay back and let the situation be. So these were the two conflicting policies pursued by British India on Tibet from 1904 until 1914. The objective, therefore, was to secure its northernmost territory and to stop Chinese influence in Tibet. So, in doing so, it was ready to grant any form of power to China, what nowadays is called suzerainty, but at the same time secure non-intervention from China, now called as non-intervention or non-interference. That is where you have the internal autonomy on Tibet being pushed by Great Britain. So in securing that, Great Britain had its objective of putting furthest British presence until, for example, Lhasa. If that was not able to secure that, they were ready to move their next post to Shigadze, to Yangtze, even to Chumbi Valley. Until Chumbi Valley, they were ready to face any Chinese advance. On the other hand, China has a history of relationship with Tibet from 7th century, and we had long-standing historical relationship as well as religious relationship, which in history is called priest-patron relationship. The Chinese emperors were the patrons of Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan Dalai Lamas were the priests of Chinese Buddhist empire. That was the relationship. However, under political terminology, China has few very definite terms used about Tibet. One is Tibet has been inalienable part of China. Second is that is inalienable part of China since time immemorial, they say. Secondly, when it was found to be impracticable, they said Tibet was part of China since 7th century, then from 13th century. So the narrative of the Chinese in history has been that Tibet has been part of China. On the ground, again like the British, they were trying to expand their furthest point of influence into Tibet as much as possible all over Tibet, if not until Shigetse, that is the southern part of Tibet, then to Lhasa, then there is a place called Gyamda, then Chamdo, then Tharzisdo. These are different areas of their contention of being border with Tibet. So what we understand here is from two opposite sides, Tibet was being harassed, pushed, and always threatened of its security and its status and life of people. Another player is Russia. Though not so much as Great Britain and China, it had its influence on the life and status of Tibet because Great Britain did not want to disregard Russia because Russia at the time was under Tsar, a very powerful empire, and it was threatening the British hold in Persia and Afghanistan. We, the students of Indian history, will remember the Persian history, the Afghan history, Ahmad Shah Abdali, Durand Line. All those are part and parcel of the great game played on the Indian subcontinent and the Asian plateau by these imperial nations. So, not to displease Russia, therefore, Great Britain always tried to keep Russia in mind because it also had an Anglo-Russian agreement of 1908 by which they agreed that none of the party would interfere unilaterally in Tibet. However, we also know that Russia, trying to expand its influence and territories across the Central Asia, was able to divide Mongolia as Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. Today, what Mongolia as an independent country was the Outer Mongolia, and Inner Mongolia is under China. So these were three imperial powers trying to lay hold on countries that were between them. And that is how the status of Tibet was influenced by these nations. Therefore, what I'm saying is none of these countries had any honorable intent about Tibet. All these countries had their self-interest, and therefore, whatever the outcome was, it was at the cost of Tibet. Now, students of politics, students of law, students of history, we know in history that no nation remained safe from onslaughts of the imperial nations. Even Shimla, we know that has come under occupation of many different rulers. Before British came, Shimla was under the Gorkhas. So history teaches us that none of us were safe from these imperial nations. So, such being the position of these three imperial nations, Tibet remained at mercy. For example, I mentioned about 1904, when young husband expedition came into Lhasa, the 13th Dalai Lama had to leave Lhasa and go to China and Mongolia as a refugee to escape from British attack and also to obtain total control of Tibet. He remained as refugee in China and Mongolia till 1910. When he was returning from his refuge asylum, on the way to Lhasa, once again Lhasa was occupied by Chinese. And he had to once again escape from once his protector to another nation which was his pursuer, the British. He came down to Kalimpong and Darjeeling. So from 1905-06 to 1910, the Dalai Lama was escaping across the Central Asia because of the British invasion of Tibet in 1904 and Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1910. His only object was to secure as much independence or autonomy for Tibet and safeguard Tibetan people from invasion and further exploitation. So you can clearly understand what was the status of Tibet until 1910. In 1910, as I briefly mentioned, a huge army of the Chinese, which had occupied much of East Tibet, attacked Lhasa. When we say attacked Lhasa, it was total disregard to the history of Lhasa, total disregard to Tibetan tradition, firing at Potala Palace, firing at Tibetan officials on the street, killing them on the street, and looting everything that was on the way. Even some of the baggages that the Dalai Lama had brought from Mongolia were robbed on the way by Chinese. And then Chinese occupied Lhasa and they placed a puppet regime in Lhasa for some time. They changed Tibetan leadership, they implemented new policies, new laws, they even dethroned the 13th Dalai Lama and had his title of Dalai Lama withdrawn from him and proclaimed Dalai Lama as offender and persona non grata when he was in Darjeeling. So to that extent, and that was the biggest Chinese occupation of Tibet in Tibetan history. So Tibetans lived under Chinese occupation for some years, but in 1911, in the history of China, we call the revolution that took place in China. Sun Yat-sen's revolution and Yuan Shikai's regime overthrew the Manchu government, and all of a sudden China was in upheaval. The reformists were overthrowing the long established Manchu dynasty, and the Chinese occupiers in Lhasa were now at mercy of Tibetan population, and there were also a lot of internal problems between the Chinese soldiers who came from East Tibet and the Chinese Amben, it's called, a Chinese representative who lived in Lhasa. There were differences between these two parties also. They fought between themselves, and in due course a situation arose in the Tibetan history when Tibetans, under the direction of 13th Dalai Lama, expelled every Chinese from Tibet. And that is one historical note we must remember. Any Chinese that were in Tibet until that time were expelled from Tibet, and by 1913, all Chinese who had lived in Tibet, who were Chinese officials, who were Chinese military personnel, they were expelled through India. From Tibet, they came to Sikkim, then they came to Calcutta, and from Calcutta they went by sea to China, and many of them remained in India, and you will find descendants of those Chinese still living in India. So from that time onwards, Tibet remained in effect free from any political or military occupation of any country. That is when the 13th Dalai Lama seized the opportunity to obtain a political or historical or international agreement with regard to the status of Tibet. That is how he approached Great Britain to assemble the parties so that a proper agreement would be arrived at on the situation in Tibet as well as on the status of Tibet. And before this came into being, His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama also issued a proclamation with regard to the status and situation of Tibet and a guidelines for Tibetans how to run their life and their nation in 1913. That is widely known as the Proclamation of 13th Dalai Lama. And soon after that proclamation, an agreement with Mongolia and Tibet was also signed in 1913, which accepted each other as free nation. So that was the situation by 1913. Tibet had now become free of any foreign occupation. Tibet had signed an agreement with Mongolians because Mongolia and Tibet had long-standing relationship, and Great Britain was also now changing its policy of non-intervention and trying to play an honest broker. And that's how, despite Chinese disregard of the first Simla Conference, Great Britain and Tibet signed the Second Simla Convention on 3rd July 1914. In the history of Tibet, this agreement remains both as an important political document as well as a historical benchmark. I might say that, yes, Tibet tried its best to secure its political and international status, and Great Britain, trying to learn a lesson from Russia, tried to divide Tibet into inner Tibet and outer Tibet, like it did in Mongolia by Russia. Today, you find that outer Russia is free country. Of course, inner Mongolia is under China. But the Simla Agreement neither promised or secured any of this status, nor Tibet today is better than it was in 1914. But it must be said that from 1914 onwards, Tibet has the best of political life in its history, especially in modern history. There was no interference from any other political power. Even sometimes in history we learn that because in 1914 there happened the First World War, 13th Dalai Lama wrote to Great Britain to say that it was ready to help Great Britain with 1,000 soldiers. And history book says that the Dalai Lama kept these 1,000 soldiers ready until the end of First World War. And the Dalai Lama printed Tibetan currency, Tibetan postage was used, Tibetan military was reformed, and all form of life and governance in Tibet was changed under the 13th Dalai Lama. Regretfully, the history of Tibet after that was not as promising as it was, and in 1959, therefore, Chinese once again occupied Tibet, and we Tibetans are today outside the world, outside Tibet, like in India, as refugees. And in this light, therefore, we look into the Shimla Agreement with both significance of history as well as an episode of our changing fate. Thank you.
It's a great honor and pleasure to be here at the Himachal University, particularly as I've spent my, just as you have said, I've spent my entire schooling years here at Tibetan school at Chota Shimla. A Tibetan perspective on the 1914 Shimla Convention. I would like to keep my presentation very short and brief. In fact, I'm going to... 30 minutes? Okay. In fact, I'm going to read out from my draft paper titled 1914 Shimla Convention, A Tibetan Perspective. In this paper, I've tried to deal with two main points. Firstly, the Shimla Convention in the larger Tibetan historical context of Tibet defending its de facto independent status at that time. Secondly, I'll briefly address the present validity and relevance of the Shimla Convention in the resolution of the Tibet issue and the role of India. So here it is. On 13 October 1913, the plenipotentiaries of Great Britain, Tibet and China assembled in Shimla in order to negotiate on terms of equality a solution to end the status of war that existed between Tibet and China and of defining the political status of Tibet. The Shimla Convention as such features prominently in the popular Tibetan histories as The Shimla Convention as such features prominently in the popular Tibetan histories as one of the major historical facts that proved the de facto independence of Tibet in 1914. Irrespective of the eventual outcome, the Shimla Convention was, at least from the Tibetan side, an effort to seek a de jure recognition of the de facto independent status that Tibet enjoyed at that time. The larger Tibetan historical context behind the Shimla Convention cannot be conveyed without considering the great 13th Dalai Lama's lifelong quest for the independence of Tibet, of which you have already heard a great deal from Mr. Teshpan Zola here. The Tibetans always claimed that historically Tibet and China existed as separate countries and there was no political relationship between the two. There was only a priest-patron relationship which was first established between Mongol rulers and Tibet and later inherited by the Chinese rulers. In the priest-patron relationship, the priest provided the spiritual guidance and the patron provided protection of the priest's country. The protection did not make the priest a subordinate to the patron, nor the patron the owner of the priest's domain or territories under his rule. As Melvin Goldstein explained in A History of Modern Tibet, the complex nature of the historic status quo between Tibet and China was dramatically altered by three events in the first 11 years of the 20th century. First was the growth of British interests and relations with Tibet, culminating in the successful military invasion of Tibet and Lhasa by British in 1904. Secondly, the consequent efforts of the Chinese to re-establish control over Tibet, culminating in the military occupation of Lhasa in early 1910 by the Chinese general Tung Yin. And finally, the Chinese overthrow of the Manchu dynasty in 1911 and the mutiny of Chinese troops in Tibet. The mutiny of Chinese troops provided an ideal opportunity for Tibetans to wage an armed uprising against the Chinese, and by April 1912, the Tibetans had prevailed. All the Chinese troops were forcibly evicted from Tibet. The Dalai Lama, who had escaped to India in 1909, triumphantly returned to Lhasa, free of Chinese troops and officials in January 1913. Shortly after his return to Lhasa, the Dalai Lama issued a proclamation to all his officials and subjects that unilaterally reaffirmed his total rule in Tibet. Tibetans considered this proclamation, along with the 13th Dalai Lama's earlier response to China's strongman Yuan Shikai's telegraph, in which he refused the Chinese government's offer of rank and cut even the symbolic tie with China as a declaration of independence. About a month before this proclamation, Tibet also entered into a treaty of mutual recognition of independence with Mongolia. The treaty was signed in Urga in January 1913 between the new Mongolian government and a representative of the Dalai Lama. I think Professor Saran also mentioned this briefly, but he didn't mention that this morning, but he didn't mention that it was a treaty of mutual recognition of independence between Tibet and Mongolia. That part he skipped, but that's okay. Shortly after his return to Lhasa, the Dalai Lama issued, Dalai Lama's triumphant return to Lhasa did not, however, end his problems. The fall of Qing dynasty produced no change in Chinese position of Tibet. Despite the earlier recommendation of China's great revolutionary Sun Yat-sen that non-Chinese should themselves decide Tibet to be a part of China, but began concrete steps to implement their position. In the summer of 1912, the Chinese forces in eastern Tibet regrouped under General Yin Tanghang and soon retook Bathang, Chamdo, Trayap, Markham, and other areas. The Tibetan government was extremely apprehensive that the new Chinese army under Yin, like Tao Erfang in 1909 and 10, will soon advance on central Tibet and Lhasa. Thus, the Dalai Lama tried to control both external and internal threats by improving his government's effectiveness and modernizing his army, and also by trying to reach a political agreement with the Chinese. His negative experience with China, however, had convinced him that Tibet could have no real security unless an outside power guaranteed the terms of any such Sino-Tibetan agreement. And Britain appeared to be the obvious choice. The British government of India was also eager to resolve the Sino-Tibetan dispute. Its paramount aim was the creation of a buffer state along its northern borders. The Chinese incursions into the Assam borderlands in 1910-12 and their harassment of the British trade agents in Tibet had shown India all too clearly the dangers of direct Chinese control of Tibet. Under considerable British pressure, China also agreed to join Britain and Tibet in a tripartite conference. The threat to withhold British recognition of the new Chinese Republic, as well as through the implied threat of negotiating directly with Tibet, just as Russia had negotiated with Mongolia, the British were able to convince the Chinese to attend the negotiations. The Chinese were also convinced that they stood to lose Tibet to British influence, much as Mongolia has been lost to Russia, if China did not exercise at least their rights to negotiate over Tibet. The Shimla Conference was thus convened in October 1913. The Tibetans initially took a hardline position on both the political and territorial issue, demanding the reunification of all three traditional regions of Tibet, Yuzhang, Kham, and Amdo, under the government of the Dalai Lama. They claimed independent political status with Chinese officials and troops to be forbidden to enter Tibet. The Chinese, in their initial statement, also took an equally hard line. As the basis for the negotiations of the Tibet question, they demanded that Tibet forms an integral part of the territory of the Republic of China, that the Chinese would have the right to appoint a resident in Lhasa with an escort of 2,600 Chinese soldiers, and that Tibet would be guided by China in foreign affairs and defense matters, and that Tibet enter into negotiations with other powers only through the intermediary of China. In addition, the Chinese claimed territory stretching as far west as Kongpo Gyamda, which was only 100 miles from the capital of Tibet. The Chinese claims, however, were only verbal, without any historical foundation. They had no records to prove Chinese administration of the territories in eastern Tibet. The Tibetans, on the other hand, went to Shimla conference well prepared. According to Shagapa, the author of Tibet, A Political History, the Tibetans produced extensive documentary evidence to support their claims, which included 56 volumes of government documents consisting of revenue records, lists of houses, officials, and headmen in the disputed areas, bonds of allegiance, and others. After studying the well-authenticated records presented for arbitration by both sides, Meg Mohon, the British plenipotentiary, saw no alternative but to recognize the traditional and historical Tibetan frontier, which coincided generally with the claim put forward by Lönche Chatra. At the same time, Meg Mohon recognized that the Chinese had succeeded to some extent in consolidating their position over a considerable tract of country in eastern Tibet. In order to narrow the gap between irreconcilable claims to independence on the one hand and sovereignty on the other, Meg Mohon put forward the concepts of autonomy and suzerainty. The problem, as Hugh Richardson has explained it, was to ensure the reality of Tibetan autonomy, but still to leave the Chinese with a position of sufficient dignity. The talks eventually culminated in the Shimla Convention of 1940. It covered 4 main points. First, the division of Tibet into 2 zones, Outer Tibet and Inner Tibet, along the lines of Outer and Inner Mongolia. Outer Tibet, which roughly corresponds to the present-day Tibet Autonomous Region, was to retain effective autonomy under a nominal Chinese suzerainty. Regarding Inner Tibet, which included eastern and northeastern parts of Tibet, the convention explicitly mentioned that nothing in the convention will prejudice the existing rights of the Tibetan government in Inner Tibet, including the power to select and appoint the high priests of monasteries and full control in all matters affecting religious institutions. Second, China agreed not to convert Outer Tibet into a province or to interfere in its internal administration. China would send no troops or officials to Outer Tibet except for an Amban and his escort of 300 men. Britain also agreed to station in Tibet only those troops agreed to in the Tibet-British Convention of 1904, which amounts to a small escort for the trade agents. The British trade agent at Gyaltsen could, however, visit Lhasa with his escort whenever necessary to consult with the Tibetan government. Third, Tibet in turn was not to consider China to be a foreign country. And fourth, China and Great Britain agreed not to negotiate with each other or with any other power regarding Tibet. After considerable pressure from the British, the Tibetans and Chinese initialed the draft accord. The Chinese government, however, prevented their representative from signing the final convention. Although this morning Professor Saran, I think, also mentioned that China backed out of the Shimla Agreement, but he didn't say why China backed out. So this is the main reason. Although China could accept the political status of Outer Tibet, they were totally unwilling to accept the demarcation of Sino-Tibetan border. And opposition was also had nothing to do with the McMahon Line. They were also willing to political status of Tibet as defined in the Shimla Agreement. But they were totally against the demarcation of Sino-Tibetan border or the border between inner and outer Tibet. That was their main contention. So, but he didn't mention that. This left Britain and Tibet the only place. Since China refused to ratify the convention, the powers granted to China under the convention were not recognized by Britain and Tibet. The Tibetans claim that China's failure to ratify the convention by Great Britain and Tibet in effect eliminated Chinese claims of suzerainty over Tibet and reaffirmed Tibetan independence and treaty-making powers. Subsequently, the British and Tibetans signed a new trade regulation to replace those regulations made in 1893 and 1908, which were cancelled under Article 7 of the Shimla Convention. The boundary demarcation between Tibet and India to the east of Bhutan, commonly referred to as the McMahon Line, was also negotiated at the Shimla Convention. The border was delimited on a detailed map which was signed by McMahon and Longchen Shatter. By this agreement, Tibet handed over Tawang to British India. According to historian Alistair Lamb, the Tibetan understanding of this agreement was that it was contingent upon the British finally securing Chinese recognition of Tibetan autonomy and a definite Tibetan frontier with China in eastern Tibet. Although the eventual outcome of the Shimla Convention yielded satisfactory results only for the British India, they were of a temporary nature. Their bilateral border treaty with Tibet sufficed only so long as the Chinese were unable to make good on their claim to sovereignty over Tibet. As Warren Smith has explained in Tibetan Nation, A History of Tibetan Nationalism and Sino-Indian Relations, ultimately, the British failed to achieve any security for Tibet or for their own border agreements with Tibet. Tibet in the following years was restrained in claiming full independence, even when independence existed, in fact, out of fear of losing British guarantee for Tibetan autonomy and their commitment to secure China's ratification of the Shimla Convention. The British were similarly restrained in recognition of Tibet's de facto independence since they continued to recognize Chinese suzerainty. Despite Tibet's reluctant acknowledgement of Chinese suzerainty in exchange for a guarantee of autonomy, the position taken by the Tibetans at Shimla was the clearest statement to date of Tibet's claim to independence. The Shimla Convention also thrust the Tibet issue into the international arena. As Professor Dawanuvu has written, the dialects of Anglo-Chinese negotiations on Tibet provided not only the catalyst, but the crucible within which the further international status of Tibet was shaped. The fact that the Chinese did not sign the final Shimla Accord did not in any way invalidate the agreement signed by the British and the Tibetan representatives. Irrespective of the current political status of Tibet, the Tibetans still regard the Shimla Convention and the McMahon Line as legal and valid, since Tibet at that time enjoyed the right to sign treaties and to deal directly with its neighboring states. This is proven by the formal note that the government of China sent to India in November 1947, inquiring whether, after the transfer of power, the government of India had assumed the treaty rights and obligations existing till then between India and Tibet. In their reply of February 1948, the government of India formally informed the Chinese government that they had assumed these treaty rights and obligations. The reference in this exchange to the treaty rights and obligations between India and Tibet, as distinct from those between India and China, was the strongest possible proof of the validity of the Shimla Convention and the McMahon Line. The relevance of McMahon's solution of effective Tibetan autonomy to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict is to a great extent valid even today. In fact, after the Chinese communists came to power in China in 1949, they militarily invaded Tibet and signed with the government of Tibet the so-called 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. The 17-point agreement, which was signed by the Tibetan delegates under duress, embodied two major principles. First, China has sovereignty over Tibet and is responsible for Tibet's national defense and foreign affairs. Second, China guarantees a high degree of autonomy in Tibet and will not interfere with Tibet's political and social systems. Many view this agreement as the earliest formulation of the one country, two systems model practiced by China today in Hong Kong. The 17-point agreement, however, was short-lived. It collapsed in 1959 after China's armed military aggression in Tibet caused a popular Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule. As a result, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his followers were forced to escape into exile. The Tibetan government declared the agreement as invalid, claiming that the Chinese government has systematically violated all the terms of the agreement. Despite over half a century of absolute control over Tibet, China has not been able to resolve its Tibet problem. If the unending series of self-immolations that we have been witnessing across Tibet since 2009 are any indication, the deep sense of alienation and resentment among the Tibetan people against Chinese rule has now aggravated to a point of desperation. The Tibet issue, however, does not need to fester in a limbo. All that is required is a strong political will on the part of China to resolve its Tibet problem. Tibetans today are no longer seeking separation or independence. According to the middle way policy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Tibetans today demand genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people under a single administration which is within the scope of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. As far as the role of India is concerned, the issue of Tibet will continue to remain a key factor in the India-China relations. It is a historical fact that only after China's occupation of Tibet in 1950, India and China came to share a disputed common border. Furthermore, China's military buildup and infrastructure development in Tibet, along with the reported plans to divert the rivers that flow from Tibet into India, have considerably heightened India's anxieties. On the other hand, China's insecurity in Tibet continues to be a major factor in its approach toward India. In brief, a speedy resolution of the Tibet issue along the lines of the middle way approach will greatly improve the India-China relations. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the seminar organizers and giving me an opportunity to present a paper at this important seminar on the centenary of the McMahon Line. I'm going to focus on the regions which currently stuck on the McMahon Line, where the previous presenter has already mentioned about this, and some presenter has focused only on one particular region, which is Tawang. So in this case, now here what I'm going to say and present my view or my observations from the historical point of view as well as from the English sources as well as Tibetan sources. So in my talk, what I'm going to say is that during the Simla Convention, it is not only the McMahon Line, there were two others important issues on Tibet were discussed and finalized in the month of July and 1914. So here what I'm going to talk is the McMahon Line itself and not focusing much more on the other two issues, because number of presenter has already talked about the other two issues. But particularly what I want to mention here briefly is that during the Simla Convention, Indo-Tibetan trade relation has also signed at that time, but nobody has touched on that. But still I will want to leave it because I focus here particularly on the McMahon Line, a treaty between Indo-Tibetan border and particularly a region. Presently it has become two districts, Tawang and West Kameng. Previous to these two districts, it were known as Monyul and which is extensively used in the English sources as well as in the Tibetan sources. So while we are going to the geographical view of these two and the McMahon Point, this is the map where currently it is known as the state of Arunachal Pradesh. So the whole of Arunachal Pradesh, not only Arunachal Pradesh up to the Ijula in Myanmar. So this border was finalized during the McMahon's and the Longchen Shadra's agreement. So here particularly what I am going to discuss is the two westernmost districts in this particular Arunachal Pradesh state, which is Tawang and West Kamen districts in the westernmost. So these are the two districts. Currently it is situated in these two positions, where for administrative reasons the two districts were divided into around 23 circle areas or tehsil. So I am going to focus on these regions, why this region is important and how and when and why it was to be included within the McMahon line during the Shimla conventions. So I would like to give a brief introductions, and not only that, a contents of my paper, giving a brief view to the McMahon line and its general background, as well as pure to the McMahon line, how the region was and how it became part of McMahon line. And then after the seminar, I hope that our organizer will publish the paper soon, so that maybe you will go through the Tibetans observations and Tibetan notes on those papers and how it was decided from the Tibetan point of view, and conclusion at this one. So while it comes to the Mon, it is a quite widely used in the whole of the Himalayan regions, from western Himalayas including Baltistan in Pakistan as well as up to Arunachal Pradesh in India. So this term is used very widely. So while it's come to the western Himalayas and in central Himalayas also, as well as in Bhutan and Nepal, where the Mon is mostly used as an ethnic group, not related to a particular region. But while it comes to the eastern Himalayas, nowadays it is particularly used to a Mon region, which is used as a Monyul also. So while it comes to the Western literature on the Mon term, we observe that it was first coined, or not only coined, or it is observed by a Portuguese missionary, Father Capel, in 1633, while he was passing through Assam to Bhutan and Bhutan to Tibet. So he observed that Mon term is used for this particular region. So in the early 20th century, it is observed that a number of British writers has also defined the Mon. What does this mean? So they simply mention that it is a lowland. So while it's clear definitions, it's observed that a Tibetan scholar, Chabel Sender Phuntsok, he mentioned that it is a Tibetan archaic word for a low-lying region with narrow valleys which is densely forested. So from this case, somehow we understand that what does Mon means. And at the same time, we observe that during the Tibetan imperial period, a Mon region is once part of the Tibetan imperial period. So we observe that it is not a new development, but it is a quite long historical process developed in between also. So while coming to the next Mon, while it's come to the Tibetan perspectives, I mean the Tibetan government of Kanden Photong, which is from 1642 to 1959, how the Mon was included within the Tibetan government of Kanden Photong from 1642 to 1659. It based on 1680 edict issued by the 5th Dalai Lama, which is well translated by a British scholar called Michael Ayres. He defined that, and based on the edict, he mentioned that the area was needed to be included within the government of the Tibet, because it was a kind of a strategic reason for Tibet to touch directly down to India for trade also and for pilgrimage purpose also. While it comes to the British India interest in the regions, it is basically based on the three treaties signed in the 19th centuries. So one is 1844, two in 1844 and one in 1853. So British have a long historical relationship with this area peoples since the mid-19th centuries. So not only that, during the conventions of the Simla Agreement, we observed that Secretary McMahon was much more well informed in these regions in compared to the Longchen Shatra, because a number of British has been gone through these regions and they have written about the regions from a trade perspective as well as from the ethnological and anthropological point of view also. So the other point is that how the Tibetans function their administrative regions. They have appointed someone from Lhasa who is titled as Lanye, which is technically means treasurer, and Zongpen, a district governor. So that was functioning until 1951. So what observed is interesting part of during the Simla Convention, particularly when it was deciding on the Indo-Tibetan border. It is observed that one of the negotiator who was assistant to Longchen McMahon, he shown this map which Professor Sorensen has mentioned about this morning also. In this map, Bell has mentioned to Longchen Shetra that, see, this is the southeastern part of Tibet. We need a demarcation from this point so that we have a clear border between India and Tibet, so that in future we will not have a problem based on this border, because British also know that if they don't have a demarcation in this line, clearly in future there will be much more problem. And not only that, Longchen Shetra as well as negotiator Bell want to have a clear cut, because they knows that Tibet was in quite weak situation at that time. China will overrun Tibet again in future. So that was their main idea, that behind to have a very clear demarcations in that region. So this map was prepared by one of the famous British explorer who has been to Tibet a number of times, who was really fluent in Tibetan as well as knows well about the region. So his map was basically used during the negotiations period. So now general background to the McMahon line. I am looking this from the British India point of view, not from the Tibet point of view geographically. So it is basically related to the Inner Land Regulations Act, which was demarcated in 1873. At the same time, British left it open as an outer line, purposely left indefinite, so in future if necessary they can extend it further. So that extensions which was lied to the present McMahon line. And not only that, British wants to have these extensions because they have a number of treaty signs in the 19th centuries, not only with some of the tribals or ethnic groups of the Monyul, where currently they are called Monpa. Not only that, almost all the 25 ethnic groups in the Arunachal Pradesh, they have signed various treaties in the middle of the 19th centuries. So those treaties were very helpful for the British in the early 20th century when they want to include that region within the part of their influence. So particular treaties which related to Monyul is the 1844 and 1853, which I already mentioned a little bit in the introduction. So this is the map which already shown by Professor Sorensen this morning, but this is not the original map. How this is a copy of that map and redrawn of this yellow color. So this yellow color is the McMahon line. It is supposed to be red color because in the note exchange between Secretary McMahon and Longchen Shetra, they says that we will define this line through the red color. So it is supposed to be in this red color, the yellow one. So now I am focusing on how the Monyul was part in the period of the McMahon line. As I mentioned a little bit during briefly in the 1680 edict and the 6th Dalai Lamas in that regions, they were the important part for the Tibetan point of view, Tibetan government point of view until 1951. And the other thing is that before 1951, when the finally Indian administrators comes and started to have an effective administrations there, they have interesting governing councils also in the Monyul regions, where when we look through the other Tibetan parts, we observe that these kinds of administrations were not functioning in the other parts of Tibet either, or it was an independent kingdom. So in the Monyul region, they have an interesting council of 4, council of 6 and council of 7, where they run their administrators very effectively and independently. So from this we can judge that Tibetans have a very high value for the autonomous status of the Monpa people during those 300 years or around or more than that under the rule of the Gandhi Phonten government of Tibet. So at the same time, what we have interesting point is that British relies heavily on the 1844 and 1853. It is signed with the Monpa peoples or Monpa chieftainship in the middle of the 19th centuries. Also, is that they contribute some money to Monpa people to give up some territories they own in the Assam foothill regions. So that territories and that money is also important for the British point of view to keep the regions under their influence also. So this contribution money is still going on if you go through the historical sources as well as the government sources, which the local people consider as a very high value in their historical point of view. And now another point of view I want to express here is that why British India wishes to include these regions a module where they were clearly understood or they have a very good knowledge about the regions from a number of various reports they have been written by number of British explorers. So, the main issue was that in the early 20th century it is observed that Lord Minto as well as Lord Curzon, they were not interested in the region to be make a part of British India, but later on they decided to include into the part of British India, because when the Qing dynasty armies runs into Tibet in 1910, they observed that some Chinese army, they were in the Chona, which is just adjacent to the present Tawang districts, where they were camping there. So, this gave an alarm to the Indian General Staffs in Kolkata as well as in Shillong. So, they thought that it is important to include these Monyul regions to be part of the British India, otherwise in future China may have a direct access to India through occupying this region, where in the Western literature sometimes they use, instead of saying Monyul region, they use Monyul corridor, a wedge area between Bhutan and the rest of India. So, from a strategic point of view, British India already in 1910 they decided to include. So, this is how they have observations of that regions. Beside the whole the Arunachal Pradesh, they decided to include Monyul part of British India from this point of view. At the beginning, they were thinking even to include Chona Dzong, which is a very important trade and districts in the South Tibet. So, the British Indian armies at that time, they were having a view that Chona should also be a part of the McMahon line, because it is very straight line from the tip of Bhutan border to the adjoining one districts of Arunachal Pradesh, which is presently called East Keming. But at the same time, we observed that until November 1913, when the Simla Convention was on progress, the McMahon, he was not so willing to include the whole part of Monyul in the part of McMahon line. He has two reasons. One is that he knows that Tawang, the districts, is very effectively controlled by the Chona Dzongben. So, he thinks that this is a real Tibet and below that is not so, but that is like his assumptions. But somehow in the on 26 November 1913, he met F.M. Bailey, who has just returned back from tour in these regions. So, Bailey has suggested that one should not include Chona, because from the linguistic point of view, Chona is Tibetan, clear. But he mentioned that from below this red mark, we can include this part of McMahon, because these regions were from ethnically point of view, they were not Tibetan. From linguistic point of view also, they were not Tibetan, but their cultures is very same as Tibetan Buddhist culture. So, then McMahon has accepted these suggestions, then he included. So, the important part is that when Longchen Shedra was shown this line, he did not accept it, but he thought that it is important to have a demarcation in this line, because one of the negotiators, Charles Bell, who was assistant to the Longchen Shedra, McMahon line, sorry, he clearly told to Longchen Shedra, because Bell was very good in Tibetan, he mentioned that, see, this part is needed because we are helping you to have a negotiate on the China, on the eastern part of Tibet. So, why not we have a very clear commission here, so that in future we do not have to negotiate again and again to think on this region. So, Longchen Shedra accepted this view, and Shedra, who was shown the map of this very one with demarcated already in that line in 1914 early, I think it was around in January, then he was asked by by McMahon, what do you think? So Longchen Shetha, he sent one of his deputy, a Hmong officials who was called Shetun Khinchung. He was immediately dispatched from Shimla to Lhasa and asked the Lhasa's view, what they think. And Longchen Shetha has recommended Lhasa officials, it is really important to accept these regions, although we have an effective rule in this region, but we need to accept these demarcations from the point of view that we are talking with China, as well as in British India is very strong in terms of military as well as economy. It is good for us. So from that very reason, Longchen Shetha accepted what McMahon has sent him and notes in 24th of March. So on 25th of March, Longchen Shetha accepted what McMahon has sent him a note in 25th of March. So the map is this one, which they decided on the 24th of March. So the interesting point here is that in the notes we have observed that Longchen Shetha mentioned that I agree with use the red mark line as a boundary between India and Tibet, but the 25th of March is not stated in this map. It's only stated the 24th of March. It seems that Longchen Shetha already agreed what is already discussed on the 24th of March, and they signed it, but Charles Bell took time to translate the Tibetan notes into English. So the English note was dated 25th of March. And other important interesting point is also that there is one document available in Tibetan which is known as Simla Agreement documents. It is completely in Tibetan, which is noted down by Longchen Shetha himself and his first deputies. So in the concluding part of the documents, it discusses about how these demarcations were finalized and discussed with the Charles Bells. In that documents also in Tibetans, the 25th March English note is not mentioned there. So from my understanding, it seems that demarcation was already accepted on 24th of March. So most probably the English translation was done on the 25th of March, which could be the main reason which is not included in the Tibetan. So this is the document. So from this document, it clearly mentions on the left side it is the British India seal, and the right side is Longchen Shetha's seal. So in case of Longchen Shetha's, we have very interesting, a number of his forefathers has served the Tibetan governments for a long time. His family history backgrounds dated around 800 years old. And not only that, one of his great fathers, he signed the 1853 treaty, which was happened in between some local chieftains from the Monyul regions and the British India in the Assam. So his forefather was also, his father was also involved in signing agreement with British India, and he himself was involved in the signing agreement with in the British India in the 1914. So now from these notes, we observe that Monyul became part of the McMahon line. So interesting part to note is from the Longchen Shetha notes, which was probably translated by Charles Bell. He mentioned clearly that as it was feared that there might be friction in future unless the boundary between India and Tibet is clearly defined. So he was very sure that he don't want to have any conflict in future. And he also submitted that, I submitted the map which you sent me in February last to Lhasa for orders. I have now received orders from Lhasa, and I accordingly agreed to the boundary as marked in red in the 2 copies of the map signed by you subject to the conditions mentioned in your letter dated the 25th March sent to me through Mr. Bell. I have signed and sealed the 2 copies of the maps. I have kept 1 copy here and written here with the others. So this copy of the map, which is from the copy of British India's Library Sources, which was published in 1960 officially, and we don't have the Tibetan copies yet, probably it lies in Lhasa somewhere. So from these statements by Longchen Shetha, it's very clear that Tibetan knows that, and British India already know that if there is no clear demarcations in future, there will be a problem. And not only that, during the beginning of the McMahon line seminar, it is observed that McMahon has clearly sent an email to London that they don't want to have an academic discussions in future until or unless they don't have a very clear demarcation on this line. but still it remains academic discussions. And I think that this will remain forever, because if we have someone who will not present what happened exactly in the past histories and distorted information in the seminar, then it will keep happens or discussions in every time. So the other thing is that after the line was signed, so what happened was that initially China didn't agree, but what we observe is that in the 1950s, when China annexed Tibet, we observed that in 1959 and 1960, China did send a letter to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and he clearly mentioned that we accepted this line, and it was signed by the local government of Tibet. They do acknowledge in the beginning, but it changed scenario after 1962, so where China make into a controversy. And not only that, when we look back during the Republic Government of China, which is called ROC, in the 1915 and 1916 and 1918, China wishes to renew the conference, because as I mentioned this morning, in the conference, in the concluding part, it's clearly mentioned that unless China don't sign the agreement, China will not have all the benefits which were provided in the articles. So the benefits were that inner and outer Tibet, and China having a complete jurisdiction over the inner Tibet, which China thought that of course if they don't renew it or don't sign it, they may not get the opportunities. But China changed and they become very powerful, but they don't need to sign this agreement because they annex it completely in the 1950s. So at the same time, we observed that as far as this morning one speaker, he was talking that it was declared only in 1931. Actually, it is not so true, because if you go through the lots of documents which are available with New Delhi as well as in London, we observed that in 1914, in 1920, in 1928, in 1922, 1924, and 1938, and 1944 and 1946, London was trying best to pursue British India to publish the agreement or declare the official of this 1914 Shimla Agreement. The most important part in this year was the 1920 and 1928, where we observed that in 1920, London sent a message to New Delhi asking why we not publish the Shimla Agreement, Shimla Conventions, and as well as same from 1928. So during the 1920s, British India replied that we are bounded, and which was self-denying of the, which some of the speakers already mentioned previously, was the 1907 agreement between Russia and the British, where they will not interfere in the Tibet unless Russia don't, China don't agree with it. The other was the 1928. So 1928 is very important, because in 1924, when the Russia turned into a Soviet Union after the Bolshevik revolutions, in 1924 there was an agreement between British India and Soviet Union, British and Soviet Union. So in that agreement, in August 24th, they had met that they were no longer now bounded by the 1907 agreement on Afghanistan and Tibet. So again in 1928, London sent a message to New Delhi, why not we publish it and make it open and declare it. But New Delhi again declined. At that time, now New Delhi reason was that we don't want China to know this, that they have now serious of this agreement. And at the same time, after 1918, we observed that China didn't ask New Delhi to renew the conference, or not interested, because we observed that in 1918 there was an agreement between China and Tibet in Eastern Tibet, where it was largest until 1935. So from this reason, it's observed that it was quite lots of interesting development happens, but it didn't popularize similarly at the same time. So while it comes to the now the Manipur region, how it was finally included in the Arunachal Pradesh, is dated back to a number of agreement which was happened. So the one is the publications of officially in 1938 of the documents, and one British explorer who was imprisoned in Tawang in 1935, that made British to renew their interest in Tawang, as well as other point is that in 1937 there was an agreement between Mongolia and Russia. So that agreement, Russia says that they will support Mongolia, but China has completely objected, very strongly voted. This has alarmed New Delhi again, that they thought that if they don't make it declarations officially, in future China may again object to this one. So in 1938 declaration was based on this same very view. So the other thing is that now how this region was to become part of India. So it was decided in 1950 when there was a meeting held, defense committee. So they come to know that in 1949 in October, China declared that they want to liberate Tibet. So this alarm again New Delhi if they will not include Tawang part of Arunachal Pradesh. At that time now it is known as Nepha from 1946. So they thought that it is to be part of Arunachal Pradesh, otherwise Tibet will very soon lose to China. If that's happened, China will soon come down to Tawang also, which means they will have a direct access to India from very